Hello all, my name is Connor and I'm an educator here at Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. Thank you for coming to Eastern State's Facebook page to listen to our discussion on the three major investigations into the conditions at Eastern State. For the past 2 weeks, we have been taking a look at the first two major investigations in Eastern State's history, in 1834 and then again in 1897. For the finale of this series, we are going to be discussing the pivotal 1923 grand jury investigation. If you hadn't had a chance to see the previous two videos, I definitely recommend it, but this video can be watched on its own. Throughout this presentation, we will be thinking about these two questions. Whose responsibility is it to report systematic abuse? And what role can art play in revealing the conditions of prisons? Before we go any further, please note that the content and language of today's discussion may not be suitable for younger learners. In our first presentation on the 1834 investigation, we discussed how a joint committee formed in the Pennsylvania legislature to bring 5 charges against the prison and its first warden, Samuel R. Wood, after allegations of corruption and cruelty were raised by prison employees. We focused primarily on the third charge of cruel and unusual punishment in the death of a prisoner named Matthias McKenty. In 1897, another legislative committee was formed to investigate Warden Michael J. Cassidy, hiding abuses inflicted on prisoners with mental illnesses, focusing specifically on the case of a man named Archibald White. This investigation was spearheaded by Judge James G. Gordon, and Judge Gordon accused Eastern State and Warden Cassidy of falsehood in their official reports, cruelty and inhumanity, and secreting and fabricating evidence, all related to the treatment of people with mental illnesses. With both these investigations, the prison and both wardens were acquitted, and each legislative committee issued a clean bill of health with a few mild reprimands and suggestions for reform. However, the outcomes of the 1923 investigation resulted in the resignation of the warden and a drastic shift in Eastern State's public reputation and method of operation. One similarity between all three investigations is that this investigation was also kickstarted by someone going outside official channels of communication to address alleged abuses. In the 1920s, a Quaker activist named Anna Wharton Morris filled this role by trying to raise awareness about Warden Robert McKenty's allegedly corrupt administration. Warden Robert McKenty, like Warden Michael Cassidy, who we discussed last week, oversaw Eastern State for almost 2 decades, from 1908 to 1923. This period represented a massive transition in Eastern State's history because by 1913, the prison officially ended the separate system of solitary confinement and switched to a congregate system of prisoners housing, working, and exercising together. This shift happened gradually, as we discussed last week during Warden Cassidy's tenure, but everything changed for Eastern State in 1913. One of the biggest challenges facing the prison was a major influx in its population. By the early 1920s, the total number of prisoners ranged from 1,400 to upwards of 1,600 people incarcerated. This population increase ushered in a chaotic time of overcrowding and accusations of mismanagement, which were made against the prison and specifically Warden McKenty. One of the best visualizations of overcrowding is shown in this image from a 1929 silent film recorded at Eastern State. Imagine having to fit over 1,600 people in just 2 of these dining halls 3 times a day. That's how overcrowded Eastern State was. In 1920, the Civil Service Reform Association wrote a report co-authored by Anna Wharton Morris, referred to here by her married name Harrison, accusing the prison of nepotism, cruelty, and mismanagement. Morris had made frequent visits to Eastern State between the 1910s and 1930s and used these visits as evidence for her report. One of the major charges was that both Warden McKenty and Deputy Warden Robert Myers had upwards of 12 family members on the prison payroll, being paid around $36,000 annually. According to this Philadelphia Inquirer article, the last report of the prison payroll indicated that 2 of McKenty's sons were employed by the prison. McKenty, in turn, threatened to file a libel lawsuit against the Civil Service Reform Association. Although the association ultimately retracted the charges against McKenty, the criticisms and accusations continued to mount. Outside the walls, a public battle between McKenty and prison critics like Morris were going on in the newspapers, like this headline, "Prison here branded an outpost of hell." At the same time, on the inside, the problems with the overcrowded, mismanaged prison were being depicted through detailed illustrations and cartoons by a man named Frederick Funk. Funk, also known as Edward Mitchell, was born in 1885 in Buffalo, New York, and was incarcerated at Eastern State twice between 1918 and 1930 for forgery and larceny charges. Funk's vivid cartoons, seen here, depict rat infestations in the overcrowded exercise yard, courtroom scenes over charges of nepotism, and Deputy Warden Robert Byers' abusive tactics toward prisoners. We know that Funk wrote letters to Warden Morris throughout his incarceration and later mailed these illustrations to her toward the end of his time at Eastern State. We actually have photographs of the correspondence seen here. For everyone watching, what stands out to you about these cartoons? Is there anything that you see that's surprising? Feel free to answer below in the comments. To me, these cartoons reveal both Frederick Funk's artistic skill and eye for detail, but also his sharp wit and observations of prison problems. Another important note is that Funk also served as a secretary for the Honor and Friendship Club, a prison club responsible for everything from organizing music events within the walls to raising money to donate to the Red Cross. According to the publication, the OE Library Critic, Eastern State's Honor and Friendship Club also sent an appeal to Governor William Sproul for relief from poor prison conditions. Calls on Governor Sproul to investigate the prison occurred repeatedly throughout the early 1920s, resulting in multiple grand jury reports about Eastern State prison conditions. But it wasn't until April of 1923 that the largest, most comprehensive grand jury report was written, eventually laying the groundwork for major overhauls to the prison's administration and infrastructure. Issues of drug trafficking, nepotism, and corruption were repeatedly detailed in earlier reports. However, in March of 1923, a unique problem occurred when a body of prisoners who referred to themselves as the Four Horsemen overtook the prison, set up a temporary office in the central surveillance hub, and made demands of prison officials. This uprising led the way for the focus of today's discussion, the April 1923 grand jury investigation. In April of 1923, Governor Gifford Pinchot, who took over from Governor Sproul earlier that January, called on the Department of Welfare to launch an investigation into what was going on at Eastern State Penitentiary. A grand jury was formed to determine if these allegations were true, and if so, to recommend what actions were needed to fix the prison. Unlike the previous investigations, which were conducted exclusively by members of the PA State Legislature, this grand jury was composed of citizens and state employees. On this slide, we have two images of members from this grand jury. Let's take a moment to define a grand jury. The previous two Eastern State investigations we discussed were conducted through Pennsylvania legislative committees. So for us, this is a new mode of investigating. As stated in the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. I kind of think of a grand jury as sort of a test run for the prosecution before going to trial. According to the offices of United States Attorney's website, if the state or federal government believes someone is guilty of a serious felony-level crime, then a prosecutor will present the evidence to an impartial group of citizens called a grand jury, typically composed of 16 to 23 citizens. A grand jury listens to the prosecutor and witnesses and then votes in secret on whether they believe that enough evidence exists to charge the person with a crime. 12 jurors must vote to indict, which will bring the case to a trial jury to determine someone's guilt. Interestingly, not all states use grand juries to indict someone on felony charges, as per a Supreme Court ruling. But the Supreme Court still mandates that all federal felony charges must follow the grand jury procedure. While this scenario is the most common, a prosecutor bringing witnesses and evidence to the assembled grand jury, a special grand jury can sometimes, as stated in the U.S. Attorney's Manual, fashion a report potentially for public release concerning either organized crime conditions in the district or the non-criminal misconduct in office of appointed public officers or employees. This is exactly what the 1923 grand jury investigating Warden Robert McKenty's administration did. and one reason why we know so much about this particular scandal. The most helpful document related to the 1923 investigation we have is the supplemental report of the April grand jury. In this 36-page document, the grand jury lays out all their findings after interviewing over 100 people connected to the prison and totaling in 1,253 pages of testimony. They describe their findings at the end of the document as almost beyond belief. And what follows are their major findings. For this grand jury, their biggest concern was the startling amount of narcotics within Eastern State's walls. They report that as of March 1st, 1923, the number of people addicted to drugs at Eastern State ranged from a minimum of 50 to a possible 500. They go on to say that they believe it a reasonable conclusion that there were between 200 and 400 addicts who were being actively supplied with narcotics, principally heroin. One prisoner is quoted as saying that there was enough dope had been brought in to keep a city going. The grand jury determines that the contraband was brought in mainly by visitors who were loosely watched or not watched at all, and through guards and overseers as well. It's also revealed that drugs were smuggled in lead pencils, leaves of books, in articles of food, sunken cans of paint and varnish, and even inside of rubber balls that were thrown over the penitentiary walls. Apparently, Warden McKenty was told numerous times of the widespread addiction to narcotics and how frequently they were being smuggled into his prison. But he seemed to dismiss the allegations every time a guard or prisoner brought the problem to his attention. This reminds me of how Warden Cassidy continually waved his hand at charges of brutality toward prisoners with mental illnesses in the 1890s. The grand jury's second finding was rampant production of high-strength liquor in stills located in cells. It's reported that between 40 and 50 stills were confiscated within the last 6 months at the time of this report's writing. Here is a quote from an analysis of the liquor found. This is a raw alcoholic distillate from a fermented mash composed of bread, fruit, raisins, sugar, and other materials capable of fermentation by yeast. It is artificially colored with brown sugar. It contains 36.04% by volume of ethyl grain alcohol. It's important to note that in 1923, prohibition laws were in effect, and it was illegal for anyone to have or consume alcohol in America. The third finding was a total breakdown in discipline within Eastern State. The grand jury makes it clear that for at least a year, there was no uniform standard for discipline. One pardoned prisoner said that the jail was a joke, with another adding, a man who had the good graces of the authorities could go where he pleased. There didn't seem to be any rules for him. This prisoner continued to testify that there were 21 varieties of government within the penitentiary, i.e., 18 varieties put forth by each overseer, one variety by the warden, one variety by the deputy warden, and finally, a variety unique unto itself, practiced by the inmates. The fourth finding was described as the era of self-government. This section primarily deals with the discovery of the Committee of the Four Horsemen, who basically ran Eastern State from mid-March to mid-April of 1923, initiating a, quote, carnival of assault and outbreaks of drunkenness. According to the grand jury report, a week before the uprising, members of the Board of Inspectors came to the prison to speak to prisoners, which the grand jury thought was an ill-advised appeal for cooperation. A committee of prisoners formed and asked to be recognized as a formal governing body within the prison. Pictured here is one of the members of the Four Horsemen, Charles Stark C. 1060. He was transferred to Western State Penitentiary after this whole ordeal. According to the report, Warden Robert McKenty decided to officially recognize this committee of four, and they called themselves the Four Horsemen. The committee promptly set up an office, issued cards of authority, and appointed positions as delegates, peacemakers, and committeemen. The committee also corresponded with Deputy Warden Byers to make requests. According to the report, chaos ensued during this period, jeopardizing the safety of other prisoners and guards. Prison officials disbanded the committee by April after sending 50 people involved with the uprising to Western State Penitentiary. While the writers of the grand jury report seem to regard the Committee of the Four Horsemen as essentially agents of chaos, danger, and mayhem, this section raises important questions about how people who are incarcerated can and should be able to advocate for change within prison. How do you think incarcerated people should advocate for change in their prison? The fifth and final section of the findings report, titled Other Elements of Mismanagement, discusses numerous other issues present within Eastern State. Major highlights from this section include favoritism for some prisoners by receiving unusual and unfair privileges accorded to them by the warden and also the deputy warden. The next section details a breakdown in visitation policy, such as sex workers and former prisoners coming to the prison. The following finding, simply titled Immorality, discusses a syndicated use of male prisoner sex trafficking to make money for buying narcotics, and all of this was controlled and operated by older prisoners. The grand jury also discusses the role of women within this predominantly male facility. Frequently, men were able to enter the cell block reserved for women, and an iron gate was not installed in that cell block until after this grand jury's first visit. They also mentioned how women are not allowed to stay in the hospital block. So if a female prisoner needed surgery, they are operated on and then immediately sent back to their cell. At the time of the report, there were 51 women in the penitentiary, and 2 of them had babies with them. The condition of food in the penitentiary is also discussed at length, and the pan-graft practices that were in place. Prisoners reported to the grand jury that the food was constantly terrible, except for the upwards of 200 pans of the best portions of food that were especially served each day to persons who would pay 25 cents a pan. God help the ordinary prisoner without money, one person told the jury. Finally, the jury discloses information on overcrowding at Eastern State Penitentiary. As of May 21st, 1923, they report that 1,682 people are incarcerated at Eastern State, with only 822 cells available. They further break down how many people are actually in each cell. 211 cells with 1 man each, 388 cells with 2 men each, 195 with 3 men each, 7 cells with 4 men each, 7 cells with 6 men each, and 1 cell with 7 men. While the cells with 6 and 7 men are double cells, that is still a lot of people confined to one space. After reporting of their findings, the grand jury offered 16 recommendations to the governor, and here are some of the highlights. The first recommendation is the demand that all culpable officials resign and better training for guards is implemented. Further demands were to prepare and enforce a new manual of rules and regulations for prisoners, segregate boys, young men, and first offenders from the older population, improve food preparation, ensure that no one receives special food, and create a communal cafeteria instead of eating inside of cells. Remove female prisoners to another facility. Create a new and more controlled visitation plan so visitors do not enter through the cell blocks. Implement fairer wages and provide work for every prisoner so no one sits in their cell idle. Transfer at least 500 prisoners to other prisons. And finally, the grand jury recommends that the governor should close Eastern State Penitentiary and move the prison to another location outside of Philadelphia. Bottom line, the best way to fix the prison was to close it, in the grand jury's opinion. It appears that most of these recommendations were followed throughout the years. McKenty and Myers resigned, and Colonel John Groom was brought in to be the new warden. He fired 90 out of 115 guards on his staff, believing them to be incompetent, corrupt, or too old for service. He also ordered the construction of the cafeteria, nicknamed Soup Alley, ordered the installation of the now iconic massive iron gate, and improved corner towers with armed guards. Warden Groom also oversaw the transfer of the women that were being held at Eastern State Penitentiary. Groom's administration also marks a change in the type of person who becomes an Eastern State Guard, transitioning from a craftsman background to a police or military background. Later on, the construction of cell block 14, a 3-story cell block, was approved and then opened in 1927 to house juveniles, younger men, and new prisoners. Unfortunately, Eastern State was not able to provide everyone with daily work, probably due to a lack of space for the creation of workshops for everyone, but the prison did strive to give everyone something to do within the walls, even if it was recreation time. And finally, a new prison called SCI Graterford opened in 1928 on 1,800 acres of farmland, 35 miles outside of Philadelphia. Referred to as Eastern State's farm branch because the prison's food was largely grown here at Graterford. Graterford actually recently just closed to make way for what I kind of think of as Eastern State 3.0, SCI Phoenix, which, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer, took more than a decade to complete, cost more than $400 million, and will house almost 4,000 people. This image here, a satellite view of SCI Phoenix, shows how close it is to the now closed Graterford prison to the left. Ultimately, Eastern State attempted to make changes, but it was still behind the times. Penological developments of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the beginning of the so-called era of rehabilitation, largely bypassed Eastern State due to the apathy connected with the constantly anticipated closing of the institution and its replacement by the facility at Graterford. While Graterford did alleviate some overcrowding problems, Pennsylvania still needed Eastern State cells, as newer prisons were slowly being built throughout the rest of the 20th century. Today, we explored the 1923 investigation and what it revealed about a prison only a few decades away from obsolescence and ultimate closure in 1971. We also explored the vital role that voices of incarcerated people like Frederick Funk played in mirroring the problems revealed in this investigation. His cartoons highlight art as a form not only of communicating the experiences of incarceration, but also as a form of resistance against the oppressive systems of the prison. Currently on display at Eastern State is the art installation by the formerly incarcerated artist Jesse Crimes called Apocalyptine 16389067111. This work reveals abstract representations of hell, earth, and heaven depicted on the walls of an individual cell, which you can see here. In the audio stop, Crimes details his process of making the work while incarcerated, cutting up clips from the New York Times and transferring clippings onto prison-issued bed sheets using hair gel. Interesting similarities arise between our discussion of Frederick Funk's cartoons and Jesse Crimes' installation, specifically the role of the newspaper in both people's artwork. Just as Funk used his drawings to depict the corruption and nepotism charges being publicized in the newspapers, Crimes also relied on imagery and text from the New York Times to create his work. Additionally, like Funk, who mailed his cartoons to Anna Wharton Morris, Crimes also mailed out each sheet panel until he could piece them together after his release. Another example of art programming visitors can see displayed at Eastern State is Hidden Lives Illuminated, a series of animated shorts created by incarcerated people in Pennsylvania, which were projected on the exterior wall last summer. Here are two stills from a work called Justice, done by Jerome L., while incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Chester, whose animation style reminds me of Frederick Funk's art style. And here are stills from a collective animation called You Can Go Left or Right, created by women incarcerated at Riverside Correctional Facility for Women. What strikes you about these artworks? Were there any images that were interesting or surprising? And be sure to check out all of our artist installations and the Hidden Lives illuminated videos at Eastern State Penitentiary. When looking back over the course of this series, a few major takeaways appeared right away. Firstly, like many dominant historical narratives, focus is placed on the men who were in charge, but it was interesting to learn how civilians, family members of the incarcerated, and lower-level prison staff went outside of the prison power structure to try to bring attention to abuses occurring. Second, what a prison investigation looks like can take many surprising shapes and forms, and today they are more diverse than ever. However, with all the diverse systems in place, is justice being achieved? Are the people in charge being held accountable? And more generally, what does that accountability look like? These are all questions that we've been grappling with over the past few weeks. And finally, the power, creativity, and courage incarcerated Americans have demonstrated to advocate, create change, and fight for awareness about the conditions of their prisons has been inspiring over the course of our research. And I hope that they have also been a source of inspiration for everyone watching as well. Thank you so much for going on this journey with us here on Eastern State's Facebook page. We'd like to give a special thanks to Erica Harmon, Annie Anderson, Damon McCool, and Eastern State's Education Department for supporting and enriching this project. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook to see updates on future programming, both virtual and on site.